Hi again. Now I'm going to talk to you a little about state dependence. So we're talking a lot in this section about outcomes and the state of the brain and really like kind of the nuts and bolts of clinical trials. So for this, I'm just going to kind of highlight a few key studies that have been done. The field in general actually is pretty small. So a lot of us use cues. We've heard that a lot in like multiple presentations. A lot of us don't use cues, but there have been like only maybe less than a handful of studies that have compared the effects of TMS with cues to TMS without cues. I actually don't know the TDCS literature as much, but there haven't really been a lot of comparison studies. But to talk about why, so there haven't been comparison studies, so why do we get so excited about, oh, you need a cue, right? So some of the FDA indications, like TMS for smoking, requires cue exposure. TMS for OCD, FDA label requires cue exposure. Well, you know, that makes our life really difficult, actually. It would be way easier if it didn't require cue exposure. So why do we get so excited? So I start with sort of active motor threshold, so the OG state dependence, right? So we know that a primed muscle has a different activity threshold than an unprimed muscle, right? If you take a person and you have them squeeze their hand or put their thumb up or put their fingers out like this, it takes less energy to make their hand move, right? So that right there shows that there's state-dependent or priming effects on the brain have implications for TMS, right? So that's a good thing to come back to. The very first study that I know of that looked at this in depression, the only study I know of that looked at it in depression, was done in a study of 57 patients. And they took patients, these were getting standard treatment for depression, and some patients were put in a negative brain state. They were basically told to think about negative things while they were receiving treatment for depression. Or they were given sort of a neutral stimulus, like they watched a neutral video, or they were thought to think about positive affirmational things. And they looked at depression outcomes in this study. This is the only study I think that is done. Individuals that had to focus on negative themes had only a 25% response rate and an 8% remission rate. So just remember this number, 8. So if you are thinking negatively, the way this turns out in actual clinical practice is if you allow your patient to ruminate on negative thoughts when you're treating them for depression, you can expect these kind of numbers for response and remission, 25 and 8. But if you take your patient and you expose them to neutral, or you force them to think positive thoughts while they're receiving, in this case, 20 minutes of 18 hertz TMS, they're more likely to get a 43% response and a 43% remission rate. So this shows in depression that even though it's not on the FDA label, there is a state or kind of like brain-dependent effect, which is really important to know. The first study that I was aware of that really did a comparison of priming versus no priming was a study in 2013 published in Brain Stimulation, and this is for PTSD treatment outcome. And I don't have enough time to like go through this as carefully as I would with a longer talk, but just as summary, there were 30 participants with PTSD. They received treatment with TMS 3 times per week for 4 weeks. Only 12 sessions, so it's not as much of a dose as we would think in a clinical efficacy trial. 3 groups. One had TMS with the H1 coil is a coil which hits the left and the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, like executive control network. One, they had TMS with brief exposure to sort of their traumatic events. The other had TMS with no brief exposure, and then there was a sham stimulation group. So we compared these 3 groups, and what they found was that there was a significant effect of cue exposure. So individuals that received cues along with the TMS had a bigger reduction in their CAP scores. And it was, like I said, we don't have enough time to go through the data here, but if you're interested in this, I'm happy to send you the paper. So this really actually was important for us, and it makes us think that for PTSD, we really need to show some cue priming. Now, a caveat to that actually is a study was published in 2024, just this year, treating 99 veterans with comorbid MDD and PTSD with the same coil. And without any Q priming at all for PTSD, they actually found that TMS with this same coil reduced depression and PTSD severity, as well as suicidality. So it might not be required in order to have clinical efficacy for PTSD, but it does seem to have a larger effect size if you do prime. Smoking and OCD, as I mentioned, priming is on the FDA label for these coils, right? So, I mean, in some ways, it'd be great if it didn't have to be on the label. It would make our lives a lot easier. But what the data show is that it seems to be that the efficacy is stronger if you have priming. The study was actually done in, I think, 2017-ish or something by Diner Klein, with the first study that sort of came before the multi-site clinical trial of TMS for smoking. And in that first study, just a single site, randomized controlled trial, they compared Q exposure to smoking cues to the effect size with people that weren't exposed to smoking cues and to sham, right? So again, kind of three groups, and the individuals that received cues before they had the TMS for smoking had a larger effect size than the individuals that didn't receive cues. And that's actually why the company made the decision to use cue provocation in the multi-site clinical trial. Bhumi might talk to you a little about these kind of things when he gives a talk. And then you saw these data earlier actually from Tanisha in her really nice presentation. We think this is true on the brain side as well. So you have this sort of tyranny of numbers in some ways, but group differences, the cocaine users, the TMS to decrease craving. Group all together, this has got active TMS on this side, this group got sham TMS. When you just look at the group average, there's no difference in brain reactivity to cues. But when you divide it into people that were Q reactive and people that weren't Q reactive, just in general in my lab, we usually find about 50% of the sample is Q reactive. So people that are Q reactive go down, and people that are not Q reactive go up. Right? So that might not be the best kind of treatment to give to somebody who is non-Q reactive at baseline. So these are important things. This has also been shown in alcohol use disorder. So priming might also affect alcohol use outcome. I also don't have time to explain this too much, but Dan McCauley published a paper 2 years ago on TMS for alcohol use disorder. And what we saw is over time, individuals that received TMS in an intensive outpatient treatment program, those that received active TMS had significantly less heavy drinking days 3 months out than people that received sham TMS. But secondary analysis of that, which was published in BrainStem 2 years ago, showed that individuals that actually had an overlap between the TMS electric field, which is the blue thing here, and their actual brain reactivity to cues, which is the red heat map, they are the purple line. They actually did the best. So look at sobriety. This is basically sobriety, alcohol consumption. So after 10 days of TMS, the purple line, the group where the TMS-induced electric field overlaps sort of the personalized brain network associated with cues, they have the best outcome, right? So the purple line is lower. So again, secondary analysis, not powered enough to get too excited about it, but it's another suggestion that your device target, you want it to overlap something that's biologically relevant. And if it doesn't, then maybe you're not doing what you think you are. And so cue provocation has been used in a lot of studies now with alcohol use disorder. Another study was done in Europe, and they had cue provocation where people actually held an alcoholic beverage of their choice for 3 minutes. If I have long time in talk, sometimes I actually pause for a very awkward 30 seconds, and everyone thinks it's really long. Imagine doing that with a substance that you actually really want and not touching it. So it's very, very potent craving. Other people like our group, we show them pictures. So there's a lot of ideas there as to what kind of strategy should you use. And then my last slide are sort of differences between depression and addiction. So in addiction, we're all kind of in the addiction camp here, right? That's why we're at the symposium. The depression group doesn't talk about cue reactivity. And yet TMS, the first indication was for depression. And they basically just have people sit in the chair and they bang away at their head, and it's actually pretty darn good outcomes. So why is that? But yet we think that it's important for addiction. So it makes me think sometimes about what's different between depression and addiction. And I'm not a clinical psychologist by training. There's plenty of people in this room that have far more clinical training than me. But one thing that I think about is that depression tends to be sort of a slower, tonic thing. So it's a relapsing and remitting disease, but sort of an active episode of depression is often months long. Whereas when we think about addiction, the temporal profile of addiction tends to be much faster, like the frequency theoretically is higher, right? So many people don't crave at all in the day. They're like functional working alcoholics, right? They're fine. And then it's when they come home and they see this series of triggers that then they binge drink. And then they start the cycle again. So the temporal profile is different. And so maybe we should think about these things. I know Rita has done a ton of work thinking through, like, what's the optimal cue? What should we have people think about while they're receiving brain stimulation? So, I think that's where we need to go. But that's my perspective. Thanks.